Sarah watched Mark and Emily as they walked down the street, trying to keep a safe distance between herself and them. She could feel her heart beating a little faster than usual, and it wasn't just because she was following them. There was a strange feeling growing inside her, something she couldn't explain, but knew she had to pay attention to. Mark was walking in a hurry, his pace quick and his head slightly turned as if he was checking his surroundings. Emily walked quietly beside him, her small hand clutching his. Normally, Emily would be skipping ahead or holding her dad's hand with excitement, but today she seemed far quieter, almost as if she were lost in her thoughts. As they moved down the street, Sarah tried to make sense of what she was feeling. She had seen Mark many times before. He was a good father, always kind and patient with Emily. He was the kind of dad who always made sure his daughter was taken care of, and Sarah had never seen him act like this before, but today was different. There was something in his movements that didn't sit right with her. The way he looked around constantly, almost like he was afraid of being followed, made Sarah's unease grow. He kept glancing behind him, looking over his shoulder every few steps, as if expecting someone to be there. It was strange because Mark had always seemed calm, always collected, and never anxious. Now, he was acting like he had something to hide. Emily, on the other hand, was unusually quiet. Sarah had seen her play and laugh with the other children many times, but today, she kept her head down. Sarah could see that Emily was walking slowly, like she was following her dad out of habit, but there was no excitement in her steps. She wasn't talking about her day, not even mentioning her favorite toy or the snack she had. In fact, she hadn't said much since Mark had walked in to pick her up. Sarah felt a strange tug in her stomach, the kind of feeling you get when you know something is wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. The more she followed, the more her instincts told her to stay alert. She couldn't understand why, but everything about this moment felt important. Sarah had always trusted her gut feelings, and she knew this wasn't just an ordinary situation. Something was off, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to find out why. She continued walking behind them, keeping her distance while trying to remain unnoticed. The street was quiet, with only a few people passing by, but the tension in the air felt heavy. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and Sarah was waiting for something to happen, something that would explain the unease she felt. For a moment, she thought about stopping. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe everything was perfectly fine, and there was no reason to follow them. But then she looked at Emily, and the quiet, solemn expression on the little girl's face made her heart ache. It wasn't like Emily to be so silent, so distant. Sarah couldn't just let it go. She had to find out what was going on, no matter what it took. With each step, Sarah's curiosity grew. She could feel herself getting closer to uncovering something, but what? She had no idea. She just knew that her gut had told her to follow them for a reason, and now she wasn't about to stop until she figured out why. Every day, when the clock struck 5:00 p.m., Mark would arrive at the daycare center to pick up his daughter, Emily. It was a routine they both looked forward to, as Mark's busy day at work ended, and he finally got to spend some quality time with his little girl. Emily loved daycare, but she also loved seeing her dad walk through the door, smiling and ready to take her home. The daycare center was a cozy place, with walls decorated with bright colors and paintings made by the children. It was a safe, welcoming environment where children learned and played. Mark trusted the caregivers there. They were kind and patient, and Emily had grown particularly close to one of them, a young woman named Sarah. Sarah always made sure that Emily felt at ease, and the two of them had shared countless conversations during pickup times, talking about Emily's day or the little adventures they'd had. It was a regular Tuesday when something out of the ordinary happened. Mark arrived, as usual, at the door of the daycare. He looked tired, though, more than usual. It wasn't that he seemed unwell or anything, but Sarah couldn't help but notice a slight shift in his behavior. Normally, he would greet her with a quick smile, but today he seemed distracted. He was moving quickly, his steps rushed, and he didn't make eye contact as he usually did. "Hi, Emily," he said, his voice sounding a bit more hurried than usual. Emily, on the other hand, smiled up at him, but Sarah noticed she wasn't as bubbly as she usually was when she saw her dad. Instead, Emily seemed quiet, almost like she was lost in thought. This wasn't typical for her. Sarah had known Emily for over a year now, and she could easily tell when something was off. Mark was getting Emily's bag, preparing to leave. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though. It wasn't just the rushed behavior. It was the way Emily seemed a little too quiet, a little too withdrawn. Usually, she would be excited to tell her dad about her day, about the games she played or the pictures she drew. But today, she remained unusually quiet, not saying much. As Sarah watched the father and daughter, she tried to push the feeling of unease out of her mind. She thought it might just be the end of a long day. But then, as they stepped outside the daycare, Sarah's gut told her to pay closer attention. There was something more to it, something she wasn't able to fully grasp at that moment. Mark quickly led Emily by the hand, moving with purpose but without looking back. Sarah stood still for a moment, watching them walk away, before she felt a strange tug in her stomach. She didn't know why, but something deep inside her urged her to follow them, just to make sure everything was all right. She couldn't explain it, but that feeling in her gut told her to trust it. Without thinking too much, Sarah quietly followed them at a distance, trying to stay unnoticed. She wasn't sure what she was hoping to find, but she knew she had to make sure nothing was wrong. The feeling that something wasn't right was growing stronger with each step they took. The air around her felt heavy with uncertainty, and Sarah could no longer ignore her instincts. Something was about to unfold, and she had no idea just how important this decision would turn out to be. Sarah stayed behind them as they turned a corner and started down a quieter street. The bustling sounds of the daycare center faded away, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps on the pavement. She was careful to keep her distance, but she couldn't help but feel that her instincts were guiding her every move. There was something about the way Mark walked, so quickly and with such determination, that made Sarah's thoughts race. She had known him for a long time, and this was not the man she was used to seeing. He was always calm, always steady. But today he seemed almost like a different person. As they walked further down the street, Sarah noticed that the area was becoming more and more unfamiliar. The shops were fewer, the houses more spaced out, and the streetlights began to flicker as evening approached. It was a quiet neighborhood, one that Sarah didn't often pass through. Yet Mark and Emily kept moving, not stopping, not pausing to look around. There was something strange about it all, like they were headed toward a place that wasn't in the ordinary flow of their routine. Sarah's eyes kept darting from Mark to Emily. She couldn't help but notice the way Emily's head hung low, her small feet dragging behind her father's quick steps. Normally, Emily would be asking her dad a million questions about what they were going to do when they got home, or what they might have for dinner. She would be talking about the latest toy she was excited to play with, or the picture she colored in daycare that day. But today, Emily was quiet, and that silence weighed heavily on Sarah's heart. She wanted to call out to Emily, to ask if everything was okay, but she couldn't. Mark might notice her following them, and she wasn't sure what she would do if he did. Instead, she kept walking at a steady pace, just close enough to make sure she could see them, but far enough not to raise any suspicions. The more Sarah observed, the more certain she became that something was wrong. It wasn't just the way Mark was walking or the silence between father and daughter. There was a strange sense of urgency in his movements. It was almost as if he was trying to get somewhere quickly, but didn't want anyone to notice. And the way Emily walked beside him, so quietly, her eyes staring down at the ground, it all made Sarah's heart sink. She had been around children enough to know when something was off, and everything about Emily's behavior screamed that something was bothering her. For a moment, Sarah stopped in her tracks. She could feel a lump forming in her throat. She knew she couldn't keep following them like this without understanding why. She thought about turning back, but the thought of leaving them now felt impossible. What if something was really wrong? What if Emily needed help and Sarah was the only one who could notice? With a deep breath, Sarah began walking again, her eyes fixed on the pair ahead. They had taken another turn, heading down a narrow alleyway that seemed to lead to an area where Sarah had never been before. It was darkening now, and the streetlights grew dimmer, casting long shadows. Sarah's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. What if Mark was in trouble? What if Emily was in danger? She didn't know what was happening, but the tension in the air was becoming unbearable. Finally, they stopped in front of a building that looked unfamiliar to Sarah, a small rundown structure that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Mark glanced around quickly, making sure no one was watching, before he stepped toward the door. Emily stood quietly beside him, her hand still gripping his, her face still hidden from view. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been following them for a reason, and now it seemed like that reason was about to become clear. What was Mark doing here? Why had they come to this place, and why hadn't he taken Emily straight home like he normally did? Sarah's gut feeling told her that the moment she had been waiting for was finally here. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Things were about to change. Sarah stood in the shadows, barely able to catch her breath. The sight of Mark stopping in front of that building, glancing over his shoulder, and then moving quickly to open the door was unsettling. The street around her was eerily quiet now, and the growing darkness seemed to wrap around her, making everything feel heavier. She felt like she was intruding on something she wasn't meant to see, yet she couldn't turn back. Her feet were rooted to the spot, her curiosity and concern pulling her closer to the scene unfolding before her. Mark pushed the door open and glanced around once more before entering the building. Emily, still holding her father's hand, followed him inside, but not before giving a quick, almost hesitant glance toward the street, as though sensing someone was nearby. The look on her face made Sarah's heart ache. Emily's usual bright eyes were dim, and her face looked almost lost, like she didn't know what was happening. The little girl's silence spoke volumes, and Sarah knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just another routine day. It couldn't be. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen in place. She wasn't sure what to do. Should she go inside after them? Should she call for help? She wasn't sure if Mark would react to her following them, but she knew she couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Her instincts had led her this far, and now she couldn't stop. She had to know what was going on. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward cautiously, her footsteps soft on the pavement. She moved closer to the building, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The door had closed behind them, but she could still hear faint sounds coming from within. Footsteps, a creaking door, a soft voice. It was all a blur of noise, but Sarah couldn't make out the words. She felt her pulse quicken as she reached the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for her to peek inside without being noticed. Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then, without thinking twice, she gently pushed the door open, just wide enough to slip inside. She held her breath, praying that she wouldn't make a sound. The air inside the building felt cooler, the faint smell of dust and old wood lingering in the atmosphere. As Sarah stepped in, she crouched low, trying to stay hidden in the shadows of the narrow hallway. She could hear Mark's voice now, though it was too muffled to understand. But Emily's silence stood out. She hadn't made a sound since they entered. Sarah's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of where they had gone. The hallway was dimly lit, and she could barely make out the outlines of some old furniture along the walls. It seemed like an abandoned building, a place that didn't fit with the quiet neighborhood she just walked through. She couldn't imagine why Mark had brought Emily here. What was going on? The sound of a door opening caught Sarah's attention, and she quickly pressed herself against the wall, hoping to stay hidden. She peeked around the corner and saw Mark standing at the far end of the hall, his hand resting on the doorframe. He seemed to be speaking to someone. Another voice, deeper than his own, responded. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone sounded urgent, and there was an edge of tension in the conversation. Emily stood silently beside him, her eyes wide, looking up at her father. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight. Why was Emily so quiet? She wasn't even asking questions as any child her age would. Sarah's heart broke as she realized just how out of place Emily seemed in this strange, unsettling environment. Mark stepped inside the room, followed by Emily, and the door creaked closed behind them. Sarah didn't want to risk being seen, but she had to act quickly. She was so close now, so close to finding out what was going on. With her heart racing in her chest, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to know what was happening, and she couldn't do it from hiding. Taking a deep breath, she slowly moved toward the door, trying to keep her footsteps as quiet as possible. Every step felt like a lifetime, but Sarah knew she had to take that risk. She couldn't leave without understanding what was really going on, not when Emily's safety was on the line. The door was just ahead, and Sarah's hand was trembling as she reached for the handle. She steadied herself, knowing that what happened next could change everything. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed, Sarah pushed the door open. What she saw next would be something she would never forget. As Sarah pushed the door open just a crack, her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. The room she stepped into was dimly lit, with the only light coming from a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air felt thick and still, almost as if the room itself was holding its breath. The walls were bare, and the furniture was sparse, just a few old chairs and a table in the corner. It didn't look like a place where a father would bring his young daughter, and that realization sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Inside, Mark and Emily were standing near the table, facing another man who was sitting across from them. The man was tall, with a rough-looking face and an air of seriousness about him. He was dressed in a worn jacket, and his eyes were fixed on Emily, who was standing quietly beside her father. Mark was speaking in a low, tense voice, his words hard to make out from the hallway, but Sarah could tell he was arguing. His tone was sharp, but he was trying to keep his voice calm, as if not to scare his daughter. Emily, on the other hand, was still as silent as ever. She stood close to her father, her small hand holding onto his, but there was no excitement in her eyes, only a sense of confusion. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't speaking. She just looked like she was waiting for something, but Sarah wasn't sure what. The silence in the room was deafening, and it made everything feel even more intense. What was happening? Why was Mark so upset, and why was Emily so distant? Sarah leaned in closer, trying to hear their conversation. She knew she had to be careful, but the need to understand what was going on was overpowering. Mark's voice rose slightly, and Sarah could just make out a few words. "This isn't the way. I didn't want this. She doesn't deserve this," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. The man across from him remained silent, his eyes locked on Emily, as if he was waiting for something to happen. Sarah's mind raced. What was Mark talking about? What was he so afraid of? And why was he acting this way? The words seemed out of place. This wasn't the same man Sarah had known, the father who always took good care of his daughter, the one who had never shown any sign of stress. Now he seemed completely out of control, his hands clenched at his sides, his face tense. The man in the room seemed to be growing impatient, tapping his fingers on the table as if waiting for something to happen. "You know what you have to do, Mark," he said, his voice low and cold. "You can't back out now. You're already in this too deep." Mark's face twisted in anguish. "I never wanted any of this," he muttered, almost to himself, as if talking more to his own guilt than to the other man. "But I don't know what to do. She's just a little girl." His voice broke slightly, and Sarah could see the pain on his face. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like he was pleading. Emily's small figure stood there, unaffected by the conversation. She was so still, her eyes cast downward, not even looking up at her father. Sarah could see the helplessness in Mark's face. He seemed to be caught between something he didn't want and a responsibility that was weighing on him. But what was it? What could possibly be so serious that it involved Emily? And why was this strange man pushing him to make a decision? Suddenly, Emily's voice cut through the silence. It was a soft whisper, but it was enough to make both men stop and turn their attention to her. "Daddy, what's happening?" she asked, her voice barely audible. It was the first thing she had said since they entered the room, and it broke Sarah's heart to hear the fear in the little girl's voice. Mark looked down at his daughter, his face softening for just a moment, but then his expression hardened again. He didn't respond to her question directly, but instead, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and squeezed. "Everything's going to be okay, Emily," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it usually had. His eyes flicked back to the man sitting at the table, who was watching the scene unfold with a quiet intensity. Sarah's mind was spinning. This was worse than she had imagined. She had no idea what kind of situation she had walked into, but it was clear now that something dangerous was happening. Something that involved not just Mark, but Emily as well. The look on Mark's face, the way he was acting. It was as if he was being forced into something that he didn't know how to handle. And Emily, poor Emily, was caught in the middle of it all. Every instinct Sarah had told her that she couldn't stand by any longer. Whatever was happening here, she needed to act. But what could she do? How could she protect Emily if she didn't understand what? Sarah's heart raced as she stood silently, hidden in the shadows, unable to take her eyes off of Emily. The little girl's innocent expression was like a beacon, reminding Sarah just how important it was to uncover what was really happening. She had never seen Mark like this before, so tense, so unsure. The strong, confident father she had known seemed to be slowly crumbling under the weight of whatever had brought him here. And Emily, poor Emily, was standing there, lost in the middle of it all, with no idea why her father seemed so upset. The man sitting at the table was watching them both closely. His piercing gaze flicked between Mark and Emily, and Sarah couldn't help but feel that he wasn't just a passive observer. He seemed to be the one pulling the strings, directing the flow of the situation. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she wondered just how deep this man's involvement went in whatever was happening. Mark's hand remained on Emily's shoulder, but he didn't seem to be comforting her. His grip was tight, almost as if he was trying to hold himself together, as if he needed the touch to stay grounded. But Sarah could see the cracks in his composure. The way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes darted to the man at the table, it was clear that he wasn't in control anymore. "Mark," the man spoke again, his voice steady but with an underlying sense of authority that sent a shiver through Sarah. "You know what needs to be done. You can't keep avoiding it. The longer you wait, the harder it will get." Mark didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the floor, his face a mixture of frustration and sorrow. It was clear he was struggling with something he couldn't escape. Emily, still silent, finally lifted her head slightly, looking up at her father with wide, confused eyes. "Daddy," she said softly, almost like she was asking him to explain what was going on. "Where are we? Why are we here?" Mark's face softened for a moment, but it was brief. He cleared his throat and squeezed her shoulder, trying to reassure her, but the words didn't come. Sarah could see the struggle in his eyes. He wanted to protect his daughter, but whatever decision he was facing, it wasn't something that could easily be undone. The man at the table leaned forward slightly, watching the interaction between father and daughter. "You can't keep hiding it, Mark. You have to make a choice." His voice was firm now, demanding. "You know what's at stake. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Mark's hand clenched into a fist at his side, and Sarah could see the tension building inside him. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. He glanced at Emily, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow, and Sarah could see the weight of the decision pressing on him. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emily, his little girl, and the life she deserved. "Please," Mark whispered, almost pleading, though his voice was barely audible. I never wanted this for her. The man at the table's expression remained cold, unmoved by Mark's words. You're already in this deep, Mark. There's no turning back now. His voice was sharp, final. She doesn't have time to wait. Emily, who had been standing still, finally took a hesitant step forward, her small hand reaching up to touch her father's arm. Daddy, please. What's happening? Why are you so sad? Her innocent question cut through the tension like a knife, and Sarah could feel her own heart ache in response. Emily didn't understand any of this, didn't know what was at stake, didn't know why her father was so conflicted. All she knew was that something was wrong, and she wanted her daddy to make it better. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that whatever choice Mark was facing, it was a decision that would change everything. Sarah wanted to run into that room, grab Emily, and take her away from this place, but she knew that would only make things worse. Mark had made it clear that whatever was happening, he was trapped in it, and if he was trapped, then so was Emily. The urgency in the room was suffocating, and Sarah could feel it tightening around her chest. Mark looked at the man one last time, his expression one of complete defeat. I don't know what to do anymore, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this. The man's eyes narrowed. You've made your choice already, Mark. It's just time to face the consequences. Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to do something. But what? She had to find a way to get Emily out of here before things went too far. But how could she? She was just one person, and she had no idea what the full extent of the situation was. Sarah's mind raced as she watched the scene unfold before her. She could feel the tension in the room growing thicker by the second. Every word, every movement seemed so crucial. She couldn't just stand there, frozen in the shadows, anymore. Emily needed her. Mark needed her. She had to find a way to step in. But how? She was just one person, and the situation felt far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The weight of the room was suffocating. Mark was standing there, his hand still on Emily's shoulder, his face filled with worry. Emily, poor Emily, had no idea what was happening. She was just a little girl, standing in the middle of something so much bigger than her. Sarah could see the confusion in Emily's eyes, and it broke her heart. The child was so innocent, and yet she was caught up in something that could change everything for her and her father. Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, but Sarah could hear the desperation in his words. I can't do it. I can't make her part of this. Not like this. His words were jagged, full of pain, and he seemed as though he was about to break. The man sitting at the table said nothing, but the look in his eyes was as cold as ever. The man's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he spoke again. You don't have a choice, Mark. The longer you drag this out, the worse it will get. You're already too far in. Mark looked at the man, his jaw clenched tightly. I never wanted to be in this. I never wanted Emily to be involved. Sarah's heart ached for Mark. It was clear that whatever was happening, he was doing everything he could to shield his daughter from it. But it was equally clear that he was caught in something much larger than he had anticipated. The decision in front of him wasn't easy, and it wasn't something he could just walk away from. Emily, sensing the weight of the moment, finally spoke up again. Daddy? Her voice was small, uncertain. She was staring up at him with wide, trusting eyes. What's wrong? Why are you sad? The question pierced the silence like a knife, and Mark seemed to crumble a little more inside. He looked down at his daughter, his face filled with sorrow. Nothing, sweetheart, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Everything's going to be okay. But Sarah could see that it wasn't. She could see that Mark was struggling, trapped in a situation he couldn't control, and it was only a matter of time before things spiraled out of his hands. And then there was Emily, looking up at him with those innocent eyes, unaware of how much danger was swirling around her. Sarah knew she couldn't just stay hidden anymore. She couldn't wait for things to unfold, not when Emily was standing there, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing around her. She had to act. She had to find a way to intervene before it was too late. With her heart pounding in her chest, Sarah slowly moved closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. She wasn't sure what she was going to do yet, but she couldn't just keep watching from the shadows. She had to do something to protect Emily, to make sure that whatever was happening didn't take an even darker turn. As Sarah moved toward the door, her thoughts raced. She couldn't just rush in and demand answers. Mark and Emily were in enough danger as it was, and revealing her presence too early might make things worse. But at the same time, she couldn't just leave them in this situation, unsure of what would happen next. She paused for a moment, just outside the door, taking a deep breath and steadying her nerves. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, she had to be ready. The lives of the people she cared about, Mark, Emily, were in her hands, even if they didn't know it yet. In that quiet moment, Sarah made her decision. She had to find a way to get Emily out of there, away from whatever this was. Mark, too. He needed to be free of whatever was holding him here. But how? How could she convince him to trust her when he was already so deep in this mess? There was no easy answer, and Sarah knew it. But there was one thing she did know for sure. She couldn't let Emily face whatever was coming alone. She had to step up. She had to protect the innocent little girl caught in the middle. Sarah's hand clenched into a fist, determined to make things right. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't back down. She would fight for Emily and Mark, no matter what it took. And with that resolve, she opened the door just a little wider, stepping into the room with a quiet but firm purpose. As Sarah stepped into the room, her heart was pounding in her chest, but her resolve had never been clearer. She knew she had to do something, anything, to help Mark and Emily. The air was thick with tension, and every second felt like an eternity. The cold gaze of the man at the table shifted toward her, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She couldn't afford to be. "Who are you?" The man's voice was low, his words sharp. He was studying Sarah with an intensity that made her feel exposed, but she stood her ground. She had to make him see that she wasn't just an observer. She was part of this now, and she wasn't going to let things spiral any further. "I'm someone who's going to make sure Emily is safe," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Her eyes flicked to Mark, who was still standing next to Emily, looking torn and lost. His eyes widened when he saw her, but there was no time for questions now. She had to focus on what mattered. The man at the table raised an eyebrow. "You think you can just waltz in here and change things?" He stood up slowly, the room suddenly feeling smaller as he advanced toward Sarah. His presence was intimidating, but Sarah wasn't backing down. She could see the tension in Mark's face, the conflict that was eating him alive. But she also saw something else, a flicker of hope, the smallest sign that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when things could change. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to help. Emily deserves better than whatever is going on here. And so does Mark." The man scoffed, but Sarah could see a hint of hesitation in his eyes. "You have no idea what's really going on. You're in way over your head," he warned, his tone almost amused. But Sarah wasn't afraid of his words. She had to be strong for Emily. She had to show Mark that there was another way out of this situation. "I don't need to know everything," Sarah replied, her voice unwavering. "I just know that this isn't the life Emily should have. And Mark, he's not the man he's pretending to be. He's not a bad person, not really. He just needs to believe in himself again." Mark looked at her, his face filled with confusion and guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as though he was waiting for her to say something that would make everything okay. But Sarah knew the truth. She couldn't fix everything, not just like that. But she could make a difference, one step at a time. The man at the table was glaring at her now, clearly annoyed by her boldness. "You're wasting your time," he said. "Mark knows exactly what he has to do, and so does Emily." Sarah's eyes flicked down to Emily, who was still standing quietly by her father's side. She could see the sadness in the little girl's eyes, the confusion, the fear. Emily was still so innocent, so unaware of the complexities of the world around her. But Sarah would do whatever it took to keep her that way, to shield her from whatever darkness was trying to pull her in. Emily isn't a pawn in this game, Sarah said, her voice strong, her gaze never leaving the man at the table. And neither is Mark. You're not going to control them, not anymore. The man stared at Sarah for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't look away. She knew that now was the time to act. She had to stand up for them, for both of them. Emily and Mark had been caught in something beyond their control, but Sarah wasn't about to let that continue. Slowly, the man stepped back. He wasn't backing down, but for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was enough for Sarah to take another step forward. She glanced at Mark, who was still holding on to Emily, and gave him a look, a silent plea. It was time for him to make his move, to find the courage to break free from whatever was holding him. Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with hesitation. But then, something in him seemed to shift. He let out a shaky breath, his grip on Emily loosening just a little. He looked at the man across the room, and for the first time, he stood tall. "I don't want this life for my daughter," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't want to be part of this anymore." The man's eyes narrowed, but Mark didn't look away. Emily, still confused but sensing the change in her father, stepped closer to him. "Daddy, are we going home?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Mark smiled at her, his face filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going home." The man at the table didn't say anything, but his expression was darker now, his plans falling apart. Sarah knew it wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead of them.